Slaviansk direction, Russian troops unsuccessfully tried to break through the defenses of the 81st Brigade, 7th Air Assault Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. As soon as the enemy tried to move into position, Ukrainian artillery crews and supporting units responded instantly and destroyed them. A lightly armored tractor belonging to the invaders along with their landing party, as well as enemy personnel on motorcycles and several small infantry groups were destroyed. Ukrainian defense forces carried out a precise airstrike on a concentration point of Russian troops in the southern part of Pokrovsk. The enemy used this area to prepare assault groups and amass equipment, hiding within the urban environment. After analyzing aerial reconnaissance data, the invaders were detected in the southeastern part of the city, after which they were struck. Enemy losses are being clarified. However, intercepted communications revealed the invaders' demoralization and communication problems among some of the assault groups. At the same time, in the Kostiantynivka direction, the Russian army attempted assaults near Plesheyevka, Ivanopoliye, Ilinovka, Stepanovka, and Sofievka. In the Pokrovsk sector of the front, the Russians tried to push Ukrainian soldiers out of their positions in populated areas, specifically in Beletskoye, Novoalexandrovka, Mirnograd, Grishino, Udachnoye, and Kotlino. And in the Gulyapolye area, there were also clashes near Mirnoye, Zelenoye, and Charivnoye.
On that same Zaporizhia front, the Russian 5th Combined Arms Army, which is the main strike force in this direction, is taking losses and losing combat effectiveness. Some units are being forced to withdraw for a complete reorganization. As a result, reserves are being brought in as well. In other words, the offensive nature of Russian actions remains. However, on the Alexandrovsk front, we know that it was precisely here that the counterattacks by the defense forces managed to truly disrupt the enemy's plans for this period. Moreover, today the Russians are carrying out actions that, according to their intentions and plans, they should have completed months ago, 3 months ago to be exact. These plans not only need to be adjusted, they have in fact already been derailed as of today.
Units of the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces carried out a series of strikes on enemy military targets in the occupied territories of Crimea and the Zaporizhia region. In Sevastopol, a warehouse at the Kherson airfield and the enemy's electronic warfare equipment were hit. And in the Zaporizhia region, strikes targeted an armored vehicle repair base in Yakimivka, as well as on warehouses and service facilities in Andriivka. In addition, a logistics center of the enemy in Berestov was hit. Operators of the 413th Separate Raid Unmanned Systems Regiment destroyed a Russian Tor M2 surface-to-air missile system. The operation was carried out on the night of March 15th near the village of Balashivka in the temporarily occupied territory of the Zaporizhia region, with the help of an F-fluorine monophosphide 2 drone. The target was detected at a distance of more than 50 kilometers from the front line. As a result of the attack, the system itself was destroyed, along with 2 Russian army servicemen. This is already the second Tor M2 destroyed in the last 4 days. The Ukrainian armed forces crushed an elite unit of the Russian army, Oplot near Pokrovsk. Due to critical irrecoverable losses, the Russian command was forced to withdraw the remaining part of the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade from the combat zone. A devastating blow to the enemy was delivered by the soldiers of the 79th Air Assault Brigade. They remember their opponent well, all the way back from 2014. Back then, Ukrainian paratroopers faced off against this unit during the defense of Donetsk Airport.
This is a brigade that was really filled with personnel, including local collaborators who betrayed Ukraine and sided with the Russian occupiers. For Russia, for the Russian army, these are significant losses. Accordingly, when such units are taken out, it speaks to the level of our professional training, of our paratroopers. So all honor and respect when such units are taken out. Exactly these kinds of units. Honestly, I don't think there are any collaborators left there who swore allegiance to the double-headed eagle back in 2014. And more than once, this stronghold has become anything but a stronghold. I think this time history will repeat itself again.
Over the past day, Ukraine's defense forces eliminated 760 Russian soldiers. The total losses of the Russian army have already exceeded 1,279,000 people. The Ukrainian armed forces also destroyed 2 armored vehicles. 19 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher, 1 air defense system, and 113 units of enemy vehicles and special equipment were also destroyed.
Vyacheslav Potsapenko, Deputy Director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies, is joining us. Hello?
Good morning, and glory to Ukraine.
Good morning.
Glory to the heroes.
Vyacheslav, we're starting from the statement by Kaja Kallas, who once again is speaking on behalf of the European Commission. She said that Russia doesn't want negotiations and is only increasing its strikes on Ukraine, especially in recent days, when in broad daylight and in the morning, these attacks have intensified. The Russian Federation is striking not only the central and capital regions, but the entire country. How can we assess Russia's willingness to negotiate? Based on what can we say whether the process that started in Istanbul, Abu Dhabi, and Geneva can continue?
The situation is actually complicated, but as I see it today, Ukraine's European partners still see Ukraine as interacting with the European Union and, in the future, as a member of the EU. And that's why the European partners want to be at the negotiating table and take part, which is completely logical. At the same time, the Russian Federation refuses. They only negotiate with the Americans, and when the Americans insist, they might also meet with the Ukrainian delegation. Accordingly, there hasn't been much progress in the negotiations so far, meaning that most of the points have been formulated and discussed. But as far as I understand, the issues of Ukraine's post-war development after the conclusion and completion of these negotiations are largely being placed on the European Union, including by the United States of America. Well, of course, they have to be involved in this. They can't not be, and that's part of the problem. And as for the United States, well, they're not really lobbying for it, so to speak. European interests. So that's the situation we have today.
Vyacheslav, but still, Kallas is, let's say, the foreign minister of the European Union. But her statement, how should we interpret it right now? Should we see it as her personal political stance or as a fairly consolidated position of the European Union? And after all, her position includes a note about security. How much does that matter right now?
Yes, the only difference is that unlike the United States of America, the European Union is not a country, but rather a union of states, each with the right to veto. Each of them has this right, and they don't have a common army or anything like that. Accordingly, all security issues are decided by consensus, and when the countries come to an agreement among themselves, then each individually they can act according to a common program. That's why the powers of the European Commission are very significant in the areas of economics, regulation, and social projects. But as for the security sphere, they only really started to develop it after the large-scale aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine began. And that's why their entire security system, specifically the common European one, is still at the initial stage. In today's world, only real power is respected. Real armies, real capability to conduct military operations. That's why, for now, the situation looks quite complicated. On one hand, the US is shifting all responsibility for Ukraine onto Europe, both for purchasing weapons and for post-war reconstruction. But at the same time, the US is not ready to include Europe in the negotiation processes. So that's why we end up with such a complicated situation.
Negotiations with Russia over Ukraine should be approached from a position of strength, including support for Kyiv and the use of frozen assets. Lithuanian Foreign Minister Kęstutis Budrys called on Europe to do just that with respect to Russia. In his opinion, the process cannot begin with an admission of weakness or a lack of strategic leverage or pressure. Let's watch a clip from his statement.
If we want to engage with Russia, especially in the context of complex processes like negotiations to end this war, we need to approach it from a position of strength, not weakness. I know what the Russians will say to us. We know their demands, which haven't changed since 2021, and they will concern not only Ukraine, but also us, including the issue of deploying a contingent. We need to gather our strength. Kęstutis Budrys, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
It's especially interesting to read the Lithuanian minister's statements against the backdrop of recent news. You've probably heard about this, Vyacheslav, how a representative of the French president talked about his attempt to travel to Moscow and establish contact with the Kremlin. On behalf of President Macron and the response he received from someone who seemed so outwardly reserved and cultured. Outwardly, a person, a representative, Putin's advisor Ushakov, who simply told him to get lost, literally using a well-known Russian phrase, basically told this envoy, this negotiator, to go to hell. Vyacheslav, really, what can be done so that they don't get told off like that, but are actually listened to? European representatives, I mean? And in general, will this failed attempt by France have a positive effect on Europe's overall approach?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, the Lithuanian foreign minister, the statement you quoted is actually very well put, very competent, in essence. The question is how Europe can form a position of strength. For example, Russia and France, they've basically been at war for several years now in the former French colonies in Africa, in the zone of the French franc, where the French Foreign Legion has been present in various forms. And these Russian proxy forces, which are made up of the former so-called Wagner Group, under their own banner. The main intelligence directorate and the Ministry of Defense have essentially ousted and supported regimes that are hostile to France, and as a result, France's influence in Africa has dropped dramatically. So, to put it bluntly, Russia has won a colonial war against France in Africa, at the same time as the Russia-Ukraine war. And that's exactly how Russia sees it. France, well, some people there kind of think they've lost the war. France can't really oppose them in any way. And that's why Russia doesn't plan to take them into account when it comes to breaking international norms and rules of engagement. Given that Europe is basically in a conflict situation with the United States, and the United States isn't really planning to defend it. So, as a result, security issues in Europe have become, well, really insecure. In other words, it's not really clear who will defend Europe. And that's why Russia allows itself to behave this way with France, and even more so with the Baltic countries. But that's a complicated and difficult situation. It's connected to the fact that Europeans, well, they're just not morally ready to fight. I mean, they're not ready to defend their own territory. They're not ready to mobilize, not ready to die for their homeland. And that's a big problem for them.
Meanwhile, Putin never actually wanted to stop the war against Ukraine. He was just afraid of President Trump and pressure from the US. This was stated by Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine. He noted that the Kremlin dictator was deliberately pretending to agree to negotiations. According to the Ukrainian leader, Washington, but it should also put more pressure on Moscow. Otherwise, instead of good faith negotiations, Putin will keep making his own ultimatums. Like, for example, demanding the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine from Ukrainian territory itself. Let's listen to the direct speech and then continue the discussion.
The situation around Iran is bringing them more money. The easing of sanctions imposed on Russia is also helping them. Our intelligence reports that because of all the sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union, as well as our strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, Russia only faced a deficit of more than $100 billion in 2026. Now we see that they've made about $10 billion in just 2 weeks because of the wars in the Middle East. This is truly dangerous. This gives Putin more confidence that he can continue the war. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, in an interview with CNN.
Well, I want to tie this back a bit to where we started, to what the head of EU diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, was saying about these kinds of concerns being voiced. The concern is not just that the aggressor isn't being appeased right now or even put in their place, but on the contrary, they're actually getting more financial resources to continue this aggression. And that's the fact. To what extent does this, let's say, spur Europe into taking certain actions? And how much does this define the current situation? How much does this characterize the negotiation process and the consultations that are happening right now?
Well, the situation really has changed. According to experts, Russia could have started facing economic problems in the medium term. That was one of the reasons why Russia agreed to negotiations with Ukraine, under pressure from the United States of America. Now, according to various estimates, President Zelenskyy mentioned $10 billion, and some estimates are even higher. Russia has already received this amount from oil sales due to rising prices, and because sanctions were temporarily lifted on oil that was already in tankers. In fact, the fight against this gray fleet has been put on hold. And in the European Union, there are now both businessmen and politicians who are advocating for lifting sanctions on Russia altogether. Specifically regarding oil and gas and attempts to return to negotiations in order to purchase Russian oil products. There are voices like that as well. That's why those medium-term strategic arguments that were putting pressure on Putin, he understood that the economic situation was getting worse, and his military capabilities and the speed of his advance are not high enough for him to have enough economic reserves to achieve what he wants in Ukraine. This forced him in a war, plus there were still the sanctions, especially the oil-related ones, imposed by the United States of America on third countries. India partially refused, and Chinese companies also refused. And since the summer, the situation has been putting pressure on Russia. Right now, in fact, the situation has improved for them, for the Russian Federation. And I agree that they have fewer arguments when it comes to negotiations, and the leadership of the Russian Federation is starting to realize this. There is a sense that, under the current circumstances, they can continue the war. They can stay in the war longer. Suddenly, they have more resources for a war of attrition than Ukraine, which is supported by Europe. So it really is very important how Europe will act. If Europe creates not just the appearance, but real conditions for Ukraine, meaning a long-term agreement, not necessarily talking about EU membership in 9 months, but an agreement that Ukraine will be strategically supported by Europe for years, both through arms purchases and financial aid, then this will balance the situation with the Russian Federation. In a situation where Europe cannot, over the course of more than 3 months, vote to approve a loan for Ukraine. It is precisely this, along with rising oil prices, that gives Putin confidence that perhaps support for Ukraine will weaken, and he sees strategic opportunities to gain more in Ukraine. That is exactly why they're demanding a withdrawal of troops. Here, essentially, everything depends on Europe. Well, I mean, aside from statements, they can sign an agreement and start transferring money. If there's a clear, understandable agreement for several years with clear, defined amounts and regular deliveries of weapons and money, then the Russian Federation will understand that the balance of power will be restored and Ukraine will be able to respond. Then the Russian leadership will have a need to negotiate. If they look at Europe, which can't solve its own internal political problems, and for 3 months Ukraine has been on the verge of, so to speak, a halt in weapon supplies, which have been used up in the Persian Gulf, and a reduction in money transfers, then naturally they will increase their demands. So a lot depends on Europe. They need to do more than just make statements if they're really interested in this.